one of the most prestigious magazines in all of Korea, and Ji-won worked as a fashion editor. But today, she was happier than ever. She had finally achieved her dream. Today, she was moving into her dream apartment. Although she was in debt for now, she didn't mind. She ran into a neighbor who, upon hearing which apartment Ji-won would live in, shared an interesting bit of gossip. Apparently, 2 men lived next door to her, and rumors said they were a couple. Some even said they were adoptive parents. Ji-won was curious, but for now, the most important thing was to enjoy her new home. The next day, she woke up late, and it just so happened to be the day she would meet the new chief editor. They said he had previously worked for Vogue in France. His name was Shin, but many called him David. Shortly after she arrived at the office, the new boss called for a meeting. When Ji-won saw him, she was stunned. The new editor-in-chief was the same man she had met 3 months ago in France. 3 months ago, Ji-won had taken a trip to France to immerse herself in the culture and see the landscapes. One night, however, a pickpocket almost stole her passport. Shin had saved her from that situation. He caught the thief and returned her passport. Ji-won was amazed by how handsome he was, though his voice had been stern and not very kind. He had said, "It seems you're as innocent as you are foolish. From now on, keep your bag close to your chest." Ji-won thanked him for his help, but she had been so distracted by his good looks that she didn't even realize he had insulted her. On impulse, as she watched him walk away, she stopped him and asked him to have a drink with her. And after that, well, she had her first one-night adventure. How could Ji-won forget? She had traveled to France after finding out that her ex had cheated on her. She was open to new experiences, acting impulsively without worrying about anything. But she doubted that the man would remember her. There was no denying it, though. Her boss was incredibly attractive. Her boss caught her attention, asking if it was common for her to arrive late. Ji-won tried to explain herself, but Ji-won had no filter. He bluntly told her that her outfit today was terrible. Ji-won tried not to give it much thought. Just because she had spent one night with him didn't mean anything. Besides, he was her boss now. But her boss wanted to make one thing clear. As a fashion editor, she should have a direct impact on trends. But today, she didn't look the part. As he passed by, he said in French, "Look at yourself." Later, Ji-won left work feeling frustrated. Running into her one-night stand had been bad enough, but now he was her boss. Just then, someone grabbed her arm. It was Ji-won, who had been waiting for her. He wanted to ask her something personal. How does it feel to leave without saying goodbye? Ji-won didn't understand until he mentioned that he had a photographic memory. So he remembered everything. Besides, how could he forget? She had left without a word. Back then, Ji-won had panicked. She had never done anything like that with a man before, and didn't know how to handle it, so she ran away. But she didn't tell Ji-won this. She simply apologized. He didn't care much about that anymore. He was happy to see her, but wanted her to understand that what had happened between them was a private matter. After all, he reminded her, he wasn't made editor at Vogue for nothing. The truth was, what had happened between them in France had been special. They had even shared many things in common, but it was something she needed to forget. Later, as Ji-won headed up to her apartment, she met her neighbor, Ha-jun, who was with a little girl named Sol. Ji-won was stunned by how handsome Ha-jun was, but when she realized they were going to the same floor, it dawned on her that he was one of the men she had heard about, the adoptive parents. She said out loud how much she admired them for being so brave and supportive, then hurried off to her apartment before Ha-jun could correct her. The following night, the CEO of the magazine held a banquet to welcome the new editor-in-chief. Ji-won was getting ready, but as she rushed out of her apartment, she accidentally bumped into a child. She quickly reached out to catch him. But before Ji-won could fall, her boss swooped in to rescue her. He quickly picked up the child and, in a gentle voice, asked if he was okay. This shocked Ji-won even more. How could he be so sweet with kids? But after handing the child back, he returned to his usual cold self, warning Ji-woon that she was still walking a fine line. Later, everyone was eating, but in the middle of it all, Ji-woon's phone rang, catching her boss's attention. She excused herself and answered the call. It was her ex, So-min, drunk and begging for forgiveness. Furious, Ji-woon told him never to call her again. But out of nowhere, Ji-woon appeared, snatched the phone from her and told the cockroach never to call Ji-woon again, and if he had a problem, he could come meet them at the hotel. Jo-min asked who he was talking to, and Jo-min calmly replied, her future husband. Jo-min was left speechless, while Jo-min walked away as if nothing had happened. Ji-won couldn't think straight. Seeing him and hearing his voice made her remember France. That day, after drinking with him, Ji-won had offered to walk her back to her hotel, but Ji-won couldn't trust a stranger, though the fact that he didn't push her made her trust him more. She caught up with him and invited him to her room. For Ji-won, she was the first woman who had ever made him cross such boundaries. Meanwhile, Ji-min returned home, where everyone assumed he was in a relationship with Ho-jun, but the truth was they weren't a couple. The little girl, Sol, just called him Daddy, and he didn't care about the rumors. The only thing that mattered to him was seeing Sol happy. Weeks passed, and the team prepared for the November edition of the magazine. The big boss, Ji-min, was waiting for ideas, but everyone presented lackluster suggestions, that is, until Ji-min proposed something. With Firefighters' Day approaching, she suggested hiring real firefighters and creating a photo shoot with fire to raise awareness about fire hazards. Ji-min immediately asked everyone to leave with their useless ideas, except for Miss Chu, the only one who contributed something valuable. Once they were alone, Ji-min started acting a bit bold, asking her to come closer, reminding her of that night. That night in France, Ji-won had rushed back to her hotel and jumped into the shower, not because of what they did, but because she was scared. What had made her invite a stranger to her room? Maybe it was the heartbreak, being in a foreign country, or the fact that this man was incredibly handsome. It had driven her crazy. A while later, she came out of the bathroom and asked if he also wanted to shower. He did. Afterward, they drank and drank until Ji-won lost control. She started telling him about her breakup and how her ex had cheated on her, but as she stared at Ji-won's handsome face, with the alcohol making everything seem even more perfect, she lost her composure and asked him to kiss her. Before things went further, Ji-won asked, "Do you really not have a girlfriend?" Ji-min replied, "No, not all of us are like your ex." With that, Ji-won decided to have a one-night stand with someone she thought she'd never see again. Later, Ji-won was heading back home and bumped into Ha-jun again. She asked him how his partner and their daughter were doing. Ha-jun recalled that Ji-won had told him not to confirm or deny anything, to just let the rumor of them being a couple continue. After all, they didn't care what people thought. So, Ha-jun simply replied that they were doing fine. They chatted for a while about work, and Ha-jun mentioned he was a doctor specializing in liposuction. After the conversation, Ji-won went home, but she still hadn't told him her name. However, his flirty smile gave her a bad feeling. Meanwhile, Ji-min arrived at Sol's grandmother's house to pick her up, bringing her favorite flowers. Jejin's favorite. He still remembered her, and it felt like any moment she would walk out to greet him. He knew he could never forget her. Later, as Ji-min drove Sol home, the little girl told him not to cry. He wasn't crying, but it seemed she could sense his emotions. He gave in and comforted her as she cried, not wanting her daddy to be sad. Ji-min reassured her that he wasn't crying, so she shouldn't either. He knew Sol was just like her mother. They arrived home, and Sol had already fallen asleep. After tucking her into bed, Ha-jun and Ge-man talked. Ha-jun mentioned that he had met their new neighbor and that she'd already heard the rumor about them. They joked about who the husband was, with Ha-jun suggesting Ge-man play the part while he would be the wife. But Sol was only Ha-jun's daughter. Ha-jun also reminded Ji-min that he needed to let go of Jejin. It had been 3 years since her death, and it was time to let her rest in peace. Just then, Sol woke up, having had a nightmare. She asked what was wrong, saying she saw her daddy crying again. Jiwomin tried to calm her down, saying he wasn't crying, but Sol insisted that if he wanted to cry, he should. She didn't want him to hold back for her sake. This touched him deeply. Her heart was so sweet. The next day, Jiwon arrived at work, but to her frustration, the cockroach, her ex, Seomin, showed up, demanding to talk to her since she hadn't been answering his calls. Jiwon was frustrated because she had done so much for him, and she wanted to get away before she lost her temper, but just as he grabbed her arm, her hero, Jeomin, appeared. He warned Seomin that he was the man Jiwon would marry, so he needed to leave immediately. Seomin, overhearing this, judged Jiwon, accusing her of getting engaged so soon, only 4 months after their breakup. But Jiwon fired back, telling him that after 5 years of dating, she never really knew him. The argument finally ended, and Jeomin thanked the cockroach. After all, if he hadn't cheated, Jeomin would never have met Jiwon. With that, they walked away together. At that moment, the idiot grabbed Jeomin, but Jeomin, lowering himself to the guy's level, told him, "Get lost, idiot." After that, Jeomin took Jeowon by the hand. She didn't understand why he was doing this for her. According to him, it wasn't for her at all. It was just to get her to invite him for a drink tonight, and this time he'd pick the bar. He wanted to go somewhere peculiar where no one would judge him for what he did. They agreed to meet at 8 p.m. That night, they entered the bar, and all the men were staring at Jiwon, likely because she was making sure no one approached Jiwon. Jiwon was curious why Jiwon was now answering all her questions. Back in France, he hadn't been like this. He seemed different. The reason, as it turned out, was because tomorrow was Jijin's birthday, the hardest day of the year for Jiwon. It was difficult for him to pretend, so he invited Jiwon, knowing she wouldn't ask him why he was feeling that way. Jiwon tried to comfort him, but Jimon took the chance to tease her, saying he didn't want anything from her today, reminding her that she had left him traumatized by abandoning him after their night together. Jiwon responded that this time she just wanted to cheer him up. She didn't fully understand why, but it seemed like he needed a bit of encouragement. Thanks to Jiwon and Sol, Jimon felt a little better, so he thanked her. After that, they went their separate ways. The next day, Jimon ran into Hajun and Sol. Sol asked where her husband was, and Hajun told her that Jimon had been drinking last night and was still at home, sleeping. Jimon was surprised that she still hadn't met him, and Hajun was tempted to tell her that they weren't actually a couple, but he decided not to say anything. After saying goodbye, Hajun told his daughter, who was still sleeping, that maybe it was time for him to start dating again. Later, Hajun was at work when Jeomin called, furious that he hadn't woken him up. But Hajun wanted to teach him a lesson. Every year, Jeomin behaved the same way, just because it was his sister's birthday. As the days passed, Jiwon learned a tough lesson from her boss. He asked her opinion on an outfit for the magazine's cover. She said it was fine, but when he mentioned he wasn't convinced, she quickly agreed with him, which angered him. If this had been an interview, she wouldn't have been hired. She needed to learn to have her own opinion. The work days went by and the weekend arrived. Jiwon spent it baking and relaxing. Meanwhile, next door, little Sol had a fever. Hajun rushed over to Jiwon's apartment with Sol, asking her to drive them to the hospital because Sol was very sick. Thankfully, it turned out to be just inflamed tonsils and the scare passed, but Hajun felt guilty. He was still learning how to be a father. After putting Sol to bed, he thought about his sister's words. She had always intended to raise Sol on her own, knowing she had everyone's support, and didn't need the father. But the day she passed away, he made a promise in front of her photo that he would give Sol a better life. Then Jeomin arrived, frantic, but Hajun assured him Sol was okay. Hajun told him he'd been so scared that he asked the neighbor to help them. But at the same time, Hajun was furious. Where were you? When you came back from France, you promised we'd raise Sol together. Jeomin apologized, but Hajun asked him why, as a doctor, his hands were trembling like that. Jeomin realized that the two of them were only pretending to be okay. But deep down, both Hajun and Yeomin were suffering from the loss of Jejin. Hajun couldn't stop trembling, and Yeomin grabbed his hand, asking him to calm down. In that moment, Yomin realized that if someone saw them like this, the rumors would only get worse. And they did. Because their neighbor saw them. To Yomin's surprise, it was Jie, the famous neighbor who had cheated on her husband. Ji-won quickly understood the relationship between the two. Ha-jun explained to Yomin that she was the neighbor who knew about the rumors and whom he hadn't had the chance to clarify that they weren't actually together, but they were still holding hands, which only made Ji-won more suspicious. Yomin pulled Ji-won away to talk. She was furious and didn't want to hear any explanations. She couldn't understand why she always ended up with men like this. That comment stung, because in her mind, Yomin hadn't respected their relationship. Ji-won started accusing Yomin of everything, not understanding why she kept getting involved with cheaters. She believed Yomin and Ha-jun must be in a long, serious relationship, especially since they had adopted a child together. Ji-won felt horrible, thinking she had been part of deceiving Ha-jun. She wasn't mad that Yomin had cheated. She was mad because it all felt wrong. Ji-won told Yomin they should leave things as they were for Seol's sake, but as far as she was concerned, their personal relationship was over. She walked away, but Yomin hurried after her, telling her to be polite. It takes two people to have a conversation, and he hadn't even spoken yet. He explained that yes, he and Ha-jun were raising Seol together, but they were just friends, not a couple. He added that if she didn't believe him, he couldn't force her to. Then he handed her his coat, telling her to go home so she wouldn't catch a cold. The next morning, Ha-jun wanted to explain everything to the neighbor, but Yomin didn't think it was necessary. However, seeing how persistent Ha-jun was, Yomin realized he didn't want to clear things up for the other neighbors. He wanted to do it because it involved Ji-won. Ha-jun had been on the verge of telling her everything when the doorbell rang. When Ha-jun saw who it was, he knew they were in trouble. It was Ha-bon, Ha-jun's older brother, a lawyer and the only person in the world who could really get under Yomin's skin. They quickly opened the door, and Yomin immediately understood why Ha-bon stressed him out so much. He was so imposing. Right away, Ha-bon made Yomin do push-ups, but with little soul, he was nothing but pure sweetness. That day, Ha-bon had brought everything they needed for a barbecue. They started asking about Ha-bon's wife, who works for the government and is always busy. When Ha-jun asked if everything was fine in their relationship, Ha-bon gave him a stern lesson about minding his own business. Meanwhile, Seol started playfully hitting her uncle, and Ha-bon found it adorable. On the other hand, Jia had been thinking it over, and since she had baked some sweet macarons, she decided to offer a few to her neighbors. Just as she was about to knock, Ji-min stepped outside and saw her. She offered him the macarons, and in return, she was invited to join the barbecue. They quickly introduced themselves, but soon enough, both Ji-min and Ha-jun were competing for Jia's attention. Jae-bon noticed immediately and told them to show good sportsmanship from now on, as fairness and generosity would be essential in any competition they faced. A few days later at work, Jia found herself in an argument with the photographer. She had asked for photos of firefighters that captured their hard work and dedication, but instead she was getting photos of sexy firefighters, which wasn't the concept she wanted. The photographer refused to comply until the big boss arrived. The boss reminded the photographer that he's paid a salary and that the least he could do was adhere to the concepts he was given. The photographer began to complain, but the boss, now irritated, deleted everything they had done and told them to start from scratch. Later, Jia stepped out of the building to rest for a moment on the sidewalk when she saw a call from the cockroach, her ex. She didn't answer, but then he suddenly appeared in person. Jia wanted nothing to do with him, and he told her he had broken up with Hai, which didn't interest her in the slightest. She walked away, but he yelled after her, "Stop pretending to be strong." Jia didn't want to cry over him, especially not a man like him, but her tears began to fall. He tried to apologize for what he had done, but he got the scare of his life when a car jumped the curb, seemingly about to run him over, but stopped just in time. The driver? None other than Ji-min. He reminded the cockroach of his earlier warning. The next time he saw him bothering his girlfriend, he'd be in serious danger. Ji-min then helped Jia into the car and drove her away. But before leaving, Jiamin warned the cockroach that next time he wouldn't stop. They were already in the car and Jiamin was going to take Ji out for a meal, but then he asked why she had left him alone that time. Jia, exhausted, responded by asking when he would stop bringing up what happened in France. They soon arrived at a beautiful place, and the owner, Junil, was a good friend of Jiamin. Junil introduced Jia as his colleague, but out of nowhere, he started telling Junil that he's bisexual, is in a relationship with Jun, and even had an affair with a woman in France. Junil told him to stop being ridiculous, insisting that Jiamin and Jun are a couple. Jiamin turned to Jia and asked, "Now, do you believe me?" Jia realized he had brought her there just to prove this point, but she didn't understand why he kept saying she should believe him. Getting closer, Jiamin told her he didn't understand either. He would let anyone else misunderstand the situation, but he hated that she believed something that wasn't true. Meanwhile, Jun's mother was looking at childhood photos of her kids. She had a best friend who had a child at the same time as she did. She remembered her friend fondly, but it was a shame she had to leave, leaving her young son behind at just 10 years old. Jiamin's parents had died in an accident, and Jun's mother had suffered deeply because Jiamin's mother was not just her best friend, but like a sister. At her funeral, she had promised to take good care of Jiamin so that her friend could rest in peace. To this day, she still saw Jiamin as one of her own children. At that moment, she called Jun, asking him to arrange a dinner to celebrate Jem's return from France and also to invite Haibon. The next afternoon, the family gathered for the reunion. Jem arrived and everyone was already waiting. Haijun's mother was like a mother to him, and soon Haibon's wife, Mrs. Jiang, also joined them. Of course, Haibon's father, who also treasured Jem, was there as well. They soon began eating. What started as a lovely reunion quickly turned dark. Jun's father demanded so much from him, pressuring him to raise little Sol properly. But now that Sol was his daughter, Jun had no intention of letting anyone force her into anything she didn't want. That's how her mother would have wanted it. After this confrontation, everything fell apart. Everyone went their separate ways, even Haibon's wife, who apparently had to return to work, leaving her husband behind once again. Meanwhile, Jiamin returned to work that evening and was surprised to find Jia still there, working late. He started watching her, noticing how much passion she had for her job. Initially, he had a bad impression of her, but the more he observed, the more he realized how talented she was. Realizing he had been watching her for a while without her noticing, he quickly called out to her. Since she was finishing up, Jiamin suggested they grab a drink before heading home. They went to the boss's office, where they began drinking. Out of nowhere, Jia told him, "I'm ready to listen to your story." But for Jiamin, this wasn't necessary. He just needed a little comfort. As if under a spell, Jia moved closer to him, and to his surprise, she kissed him.